We all grew up believing Hollywood's golden age was flawless. Perfect smiles, glamorous gowns, and stars who seemed larger than life. But what if I told you the reality was far less dazzling? What if behind those sparkling eyes and legendary kisses was something shocking and honestly kind of disgusting? The truth is, many of the most beautiful stars of the 20th century carried secrets the studios worked hard to hide. Secrets that co-stars whispered about and film crews could never forget. Bad breath that cleared a set. Body odor that turned romantic scenes into nightmares. Even reclusive billionaires who stopped bathing altogether. Tonight, we're lifting the curtain on the side of Hollywood you were never supposed to know. The stomach-turning hygiene habits that shattered the illusion of perfection. It's messy, it's human, and once you hear it, you'll never look at these classic films the same way again. The studio illusion, 60-90 seconds. The golden age perfected the industrial manufacture of beauty. Salaried dentists, barbers, skin specialists, and wardrobe surgeons worked like an assembly line. Cap a canine, raise a hairline, bind a waist, corset a career. Publicists filed stories about daily bubble baths and apricot scrubs. Columns promised peaches and cream complexions and mint-fresh morning rituals. But the studio system also weaponized secrecy. Contracts contained morality clauses, gossip editors were paid off, studio fixers handled problems before they reached the papers. If a star's breath could wilt flowers, not news. If an idol refused to bathe, not news. If a legend's dentures turned intimate scenes into biohazards, not news. On sound stages sealed to the press, makeup artists fought decay, wardrobes steamed out scent, and directors cut around closeness. The camera added 10 pounds, sure, but it also added 10 layers of fiction. With that context, here are the icons whose cleanliness or lack thereof became the stuff of whispered legend. Clark Gable, the king with catastrophic breath, expanded. Clark Gable wasn't just Hollywood royalty, he was the leading man. Gone with the Wind cemented him as immortal. His smirk, his broad shoulders, his drawl, it all screamed charisma. But once the camera cut, his co-stars sometimes struggled to stay in character for one simple reason: his breath could clear a room. The problem stemmed from severe gum disease in his early 30s, a condition so bad that doctors made the decision to extract nearly all of his teeth. Instead of a young man's smile, he wore nearly full dentures before. Early 20th century dentures weren't sleek porcelain like today's. They were thick, clunky, and often poorly fitted. They rubbed, they trapped food, and worst of all, they emitted an odor that stuck with him for decades. Vivien Leigh, his legendary partner in Gone with the Wind, reportedly complained privately that kissing scenes were far less romantic than they looked. Directors sometimes shot multiple angles of close-ups to reduce how long she had to be directly in Gable's face. Decades later, when he starred opposite Sophia Loren in It Started in Naples, she allegedly requested fewer retakes for kissing scenes, not because she disliked him, but because his breath was unbearable by that stage of his career. Crew members whispered that the problem wasn't just bad breath, it was a wall of scent. A mix of old dental adhesives, smoke, he was a heavy smoker, and alcohol. By the 1960s, it could hit you from several feet away, but no one dared confront him. He was still the king, and the studios knew audiences weren't paying for his hygiene, they were paying for his myth. What makes Gable's case fascinating is how it reflects Hollywood's double standard. Studios spent fortunes ensuring he always looked immaculate: pressed suits, perfect lighting, a face powdered to hide sweat under hot lamps. But behind the lens, his co-stars were praying for oxygen. So the next time you watch Rhett Butler declare he doesn't give a damn, remember the women he kissed probably did about his breath. Joan Crawford, immaculate everywhere, except the mouth, expanded. Joan Crawford built her empire on control. She was the queen of discipline, ice posture, perfect gowns, immaculate home. She scrubbed her sinks until they squeaked, demanded polished floors, and insisted on spotless presentation. But the one thing she couldn't conquer, her teeth. In pursuit of sharper cheekbones and a more photogenic face, Crawford reportedly underwent a cosmetic fad procedure that involved extracting molars to create hollows in her cheeks. The result? Severe infections, misaligned teeth, and eventually caps and bridges cemented in place. That cement became a breeding ground for bacteria, leaving her with chronic dental issues. The irony is cruel. Her most iconic feature, those bold red lips, hid her most persistent weakness. Makeup artists described the paradox. While her hair, wardrobe, and posture were flawless, her mouth told another story. As she aged, photographers had to carefully light her face to soften the swelling around her gums. Some even claimed that heavy drinking worsened the odor, making her breath sour and unpleasant during long shoots. Behind closed doors, Crawford was known to be a perfectionist about everything else. She washed her hands obsessively, scrubbed her children's toys with bleach, and even demanded her home smell faintly of lavender water. Yet her colleagues joked that she could sanitize a bathroom to hospital standards and still step out with breath that could peel paint. The tragedy here isn't mockery, it's the price of Hollywood's obsession with image. Crawford's suffering wasn't laziness, it was the direct result of a studio system that forced stars to mutilate themselves for beauty. Her smile was a brand, and she paid for it every day of her life. Marilyn Monroe, the dirty bombshell, expanded. Marilyn Monroe embodied perfection, flawless skin, shimmering hair, breathy voice. Men adored her, women envied her, but according to those who knew her intimately, Marilyn's hygiene habits were anything but glamorous. Clark Gable, her co-star in The Misfits, reportedly had no interest in pursuing her romantically, despite endless tabloid speculation. Why? As one biographer wrote, Monroe rarely bathed, didn't wear deodorant, and often showed up in wrinkled or unwashed clothes. For a man like Gable, who was obsessed with cleanliness, Marilyn's habits were a deal-breaker. Her trusted makeup artist, Whitey Snyder, became the unsung hero of her hygiene. Colleagues claimed he always kept baby wipes, powders, and perfumes at hand to freshen Marilyn between takes. Wardrobe assistants recalled that her lingerie was often skipped entirely, while her dresses absorbed days of wear before being cleaned. One story from the 7-year It shoot describes Monroe arriving on set after several days without bathing. The iconic white dress scene may look fresh and spontaneous, but crew members later admitted they were holding their breath as much as holding their equipment. What makes Monroe's story especially striking is the contrast. To the world, she was the ultimate fantasy, immaculate, untouchable. To those up close, she was a bundle of contradictions, dazzlingly beautiful, yet indifferent to the basics of hygiene. Whether this came from carelessness, depression, or rebellion against Hollywood's expectations is debated. But what's undeniable is how the lens transformed. It made sweat sparkle, grime glow, and flaws vanish. The screen didn't lie, it simply didn't smell. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who sailed on sweat, expanded. Errol Flynn swung from chandeliers, scaled castle walls, and kissed maidens like a pirate poet. He was dashing, charming, and irresistible. But when the cameras stopped, his reputation wasn't just for womanizing, it was for reek. Flynn was a heavy drinker, notorious for starting his day with champagne and ending it with whiskey. The alcohol seeped through his skin, creating a constant odor. Crew members joked that you could smell him before you saw him. His sweat reportedly carried the sharp tang of liquor, and by afternoon his breath could empty a room. Wardrobe departments developed special strategies just for Flynn. His costumes were designed with removable armpit panels, allowing sweat-soaked sections to be swapped mid-day. One wardrobe supervisor admitted she often kept multiple versions of his costumes on standby, not because of stunts or damage, but because Flynn wore them out by smell. Olivia de Havilland, his frequent co-star, was one of the few who could delicately confront him. She reportedly offered him mouthwash or mints before kissing scenes, presenting it as a kind gesture rather than a complaint. Her diplomacy kept productions running smoothly, but others weren't so patient. Several actresses privately dreaded intimate scenes with Flynn, describing them as a professional duty, not a pleasure. And yet Flynn's charm never waned. Audiences never smelled what his colleagues endured. To millions, he remained the heroic rogue. To those on set, he was a reminder that charisma can outshine almost anything, even a hangover in a bottle green doublet. Marlon Brando, method acting, method stinking, expanded. Marlon Brando revolutionized acting. His raw performances in A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront set a new standard, but alongside his brilliance came a notorious indifference to personal hygiene. Brando reportedly believed odor was part of authenticity. He often refused to wear deodorant, skipped showers, and let his sweat become part of the character. Vivian Leigh, his Streetcar co-star, privately complained that his body odor made intimate scenes nearly unbearable. Elia Kazan, the director, allegedly had to beg Brando to clean himself before filming key close-ups. By the 1970s, during Apocalypse Now, things had worsened. Brando had gained weight, was mentally erratic, and often showed up on set unwashed. Francis Ford Coppola and his crew weren't just battling the jungle, they were battling Brando's odor, which became legendary among those who worked with him. What's fascinating is how intentional some of this seemed. Brando rejected the polished norms of Hollywood. He let himself look and smell like ordinary people, even when ordinary people showered. To him, natural sweat was as much part of a performance as a costume. Co-stars, however, weren't method actors, they were survivors. Brando's story isn't just about hygiene, it's about rebellion. He didn't want to be Clark Gable, with perfect suits and mint breath. He wanted to be real, but in his pursuit of authenticity, he made his colleagues pay the price, one suffocating close-up at a time. James Dean, rebel without a shower. James Dean embodied youth rebellion. Leather jacket, cigarette dangling, eyes that screamed defiance. He was the symbol of restless post-war America. Girls plastered his posters on their walls, boys copied his style, and Hollywood crowned him its eternal rebel. But those who worked closest with him whispered a less glamorous truth. Dean wasn't just a rebel without a cause, he was a rebel without soap. Crew members on Rebel Without a Cause recalled the discomfort of working in tight spaces with Dean. He often wore the same jeans and shirts for days, sometimes weeks without washing them. Director Nicholas Ray reportedly had to pull him aside more than once after complaints about his body odor reached him. Dean would shrug, mumble something about not caring what people thought, and go right back to his old ways. Natalie Wood, his co-star, handled things with quiet professionalism. But insiders noticed the subtle shift during their romantic scenes, Wood leaning away just slightly, her posture tightening. The camera caught chemistry, her nose caught something else. His habits weren't only laziness. Friends from his early days in New York remembered Dean's cramped apartment with barely any hot water. Hygiene wasn't convenience, it was hassle. Even after he became famous, those habits stuck. One friend recalled, he had this pair of red socks he wore for weeks. He said they were lucky. By the end, they were stiff enough to stand on their own. Julie Harris, who worked with him on East of Eden, remembered his beloved leather jacket that he almost never cleaned. He believed the grime gave it character. To Dean, dirt wasn't dirt, it was authenticity. The problem, authenticity has a smell, and his colleagues were stuck inhaling it. Dean's hygiene fit his persona raw, careless, untamed. He wasn't polished like Cary Grant, or controlled like Clark Gable. He was real, but real came with consequence. His lack of bathing, unwashed clothes, and general disregard for cleanliness turned him into the perfect metaphor for his short, fiery career. Brilliant, intoxicating, unforgettable, and impossible to live with for long. Judy Garland. When stardom and struggle stole cleanliness, Judy Garland wasn't just a star, she was the star. Dorothy's ruby slippers carried her straight into American hearts, and her voice could melt even the hardest soul. But behind the glittering image was a young woman crushed by the machine of MGM and later by her own demons. And one of the most visible, but least discussed symptoms of her decline was her hygiene. From the moment MGM signed her as a child, Judy was treated less like a girl and more like a product. Executives put her on a brutal regimen, stimulants to keep her working, sedatives to make her sleep, diet pills to control her weight. Sleep-deprived, malnourished, chemically dependent, hygiene quickly fell down her list of priorities. Makeup artist on The Wizard of Oz remembered a 16-year-old Judy who already looked exhausted beyond her years. Her skin was troubled, her breath sometimes sour from the pills, and her hair required constant fixing. But she was a child trying to survive a system that cared more about box office numbers than about her well-being. As she grew older, Garland's struggle with addiction deepened. Those close to her reported cycles. On good days, she was immaculate, bathed, radiant. The Judy fans adored. On bad days, when depression and alcohol gripped her, she might arrive on set unwashed, with clothes wrinkled from days of wear, and breath heavy with cigarettes and liquor. One assistant confessed her unofficial job wasn't just to keep Judy on schedule, it was to make sure she bathed before appearing on camera. During the filming of A Star is Born 1954, her husband Sid Luft went so far as to assign someone the task of checking her grooming before each take. Not because Judy didn't care, but because the battle inside her was so consuming that things like showers and brushing her teeth often got lost in the storm. By the 1960s, co-stars like Dirk Bogarde noticed her condition changing from day to day. When she was well, he later said, she was a dream. When she wasn't, it broke your heart. Her hygiene wasn't laziness, it was the outward mark of an inward war. Perhaps that's why her fans never turned on her. They saw the truth. Judy wasn't dirty because she was careless. She was broken because a system that claimed to make stars had chewed her up and left her in pieces. And sometimes those pieces showed not in the songs she sang, but in the smell of whiskey on her breath, or the disheveled hair she barely had time to comb. Elvis Presley, the king with breath that could kill the romance. To his fans, Elvis Presley was perfection. Jet black hair slicked to impossible heights, tailored suits that clung to his body, and a smile that could set entire arenas on fire. But step past the hairspray and stage lights, and you'd find a man whose hygiene was far less than royal. Elvis was meticulous about some things. His hair, for example, could take hours to style. He layered it with black dye, pomade, and wax until it gleamed under the light. But when it came to dental care, the king was shockingly negligent. As his prescription drug use escalated in the 1960s, Elvis's teeth began to discolor, decay, and rot. With them came a breath so foul that co-stars dreaded romantic scenes with him. Actress Mary Ann Mobley, who appeared in Girl Happy 1965, later admitted that kissing Elvis was nothing like the dream fans imagined. It was a nightmare of bad breath and nicotine. Another co-star, Susanna Lee, revealed that she learned how to fake kisses on camera just to avoid breathing in his halitosis. The contradiction was almost comical. Elvis would spend half the day in front of a mirror fussing over his hair but couldn't be bothered to brush his teeth. He would bathe in cologne yet leave his mouth smelling like decay and pharmaceuticals. By the 1970s, things grew worse. Years of pill abuse made him forget basic routines altogether. His personal physician recalled that in his final years, Elvis would sometimes go days without brushing, and dentists avoided calling attention to it because nobody told the king what to do. On stage in Las Vegas, no one suspected he was still Elvis, hips swinging, sweat flying, women screaming. But off stage in quiet moments, even his closest friends admitted the king of rock and roll smelled far less like royalty and far more like tragedy. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed beauty who sometimes didn't bother, Elizabeth Taylor was the very definition of glamour. Her violet eyes, her diamonds, her magnetic beauty, she was Cleopatra reborn. But those who knew her privately whispered that the Queen of Hollywood sometimes ruled without a shower. Taylor's hygiene, like Judy Garland's, often depended on her emotional state. When she was happy, especially at the start of her turbulent romances, she was radiant, polished, meticulous. But when depression or chaos crept into her life, so did neglect. During the filming of Cleopatra 1963, one of the most expensive productions in history, Italian crew members were shocked by what they called American hygiene standard. Taylor would sometimes go days without bathing, relying instead on heavy perfume and powder to mask odors. It worked on camera, the goddess gleamed under the lights, but off camera the fragrance couldn't always hide the truth. Directors and assistants developed a quiet system to help her. Instead of embarrassing her, they'd casually mention that a hot bath had been prepared in her trailer between takes. It wasn't framed as criticism, it was presented as luxury. Most times Taylor accepted, but insiders admitted there were stretches where she simply refused. Her relationship with Richard Burton, notorious for its volcanic ups and downs, seemed to influence her grooming the most. When they were blissfully in love, she was radiant, always freshly bathed and glowing. When they fought, sometimes not speaking for days, her appearance, she'd wear the same clothes repeatedly, her hair unwashed, her skin dulled. For a woman remembered as one of the most beautiful in film history, Taylor's lapses in hygiene shocked those closest to her. Yet just like Garland, her struggles weren't about laziness. They were signs of a woman battling inner storms while the world demanded she look like a goddess. And more often than not, the mask of Cleopatra was enough to fool the cameras, even if the crew just off stage knew better. Behind the glamour of Golden Age Hollywood, the truth about its biggest stars was far less polished and often stomach-turning. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, carried dentures that gave him such legendary halitosis, his kisses made co-stars recoil, while Joan Crawford's obsessive perfectionism couldn't hide the dental disasters that left her breath foul during her reign as MGM's queen. Marilyn Monroe, immortalized as the ultimate bombshell, often skipped bathing and deodorant, shocking even Clark Gable himself. Howard Hughes went the opposite direction, once a meticulous playboy, later reduced to a reclusive germaphobe, who refused to bathe and sat surrounded by jars of his own urine. Errol Flynn's alcoholism seeped through his skin, leaving him drenched in sweat that reeked of liquor, while Marlon Brando, dismissive of hygiene altogether, wore his body odor like a method actor's badge of honor, suffocating co-stars on stage and screen. James Dean too seemed to rebel against soap, wearing the same clothes for weeks and cultivating an aura of grime that unsettled Natalie Wood during Rebel Without a Cause. For Judy Garland, hygiene was not rebellion but collateral damage from pills, depression and the crushing demands of the studio system. Montgomery Clift's downfall was similar, his post-accident pain and addictions eroding his ability to care for himself. Elvis Presley, meanwhile, was meticulous about his hair, but not his teeth. His drug use turned his breath into a nightmare for on-screen lovers. Elizabeth Taylor, whose beauty defined an era, sometimes masked days without bathing beneath heavy perfume during turbulent periods with Richard Burton. Charlie Chaplin blurred art and life, sometimes carrying his tramp's disheveled odor home, while Humphrey Bogart's chain-smoking and whiskey habit made his breath notorious, even in his most romantic role. Rita Hayworth suffered a crueler fate. The electrolysis that gave her perfect hairline left her scalp permanently diseased, forcing stylists to mask flakes and odor with powders. And Tallulah Bankhead, she flaunted her filth, declaring herself as pure as driven slush, while skipping baths altogether and drowning herself in bourbon. Together, these icons remind us that Hollywood's brightest stars didn't just shine, they sweated, reeked, and rotted behind the curtain, leaving their crews to suffer the stench, while cameras preserved only the illusion of perfection.